thanks to all of you who are here in the room with us and online. It's a pleasure to have you here. And most of all, it's a pleasure to have you here, Lily. Lily is an old friend and colleague from my days at Arizona State University. So it was a real thrill when she reached out about the possibility of coming to talk about her important new book, which is the subject of discussion today. So just as a bit of background, Lily is an associate professor in the School of Public Affairs at Arizona State University. She's originally from NorCal, which is why we have the director's chairs here, by the way, so that you know that you're in Southern California.
Of course,
right?
of course.
So we had to do something at LA for you. Did her undergraduate degree in economics with a minor in environmental policy, I think it was, at University of California, Berkeley, then went over to London to do a master's degree in economics at University College London, and then did a PhD at the University of Washington in public policy and management. Is that right? Did I get it right?
Indeed.
More or less, right? Okay, good. So the main impetus for the discussion today is that Lily just published a book, I think was it last year with MIT Press?
Yes.
Yeah. And the title of that book is Corporations at Climate Crossroads, Multi-Level Governance, Public Policy, and Global Climate Actions. So I guess the first question is, why did you write this book?
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris.
Yeah.
It is such a delight to be here at USC, the Price School of Public Policy. Thanks for the question. About a decade ago, I had spent some time at Oxford at the Botanic School of Government, where I was in a workshop with policy scholars as well as political scientists. And we were convening about environmental policy, environmental politics. And it was at that time, as an economist and public policy scholar, that I started to take kind of very seriously how economics and politics, in fact, interact, and with the role of global businesses as a central actor, notably the fact that about 100 global businesses, fossil fuel companies, are responsible for the bulk of annual global emissions. And it was really clear that what is happening within the firm, the internal incentive structures had to be aligned with what's happening kind of the regulatory regime and global governance. And so it was at that time I started thinking about the role of these multinational companies with large carbon footprints.
Excellent. All right, so let's jump right to the conclusion. What are the key takeaways from the book that you want people to leave with? And then we'll get into some of the specific issues.
Sure. I think there are a couple of kind of main takeaways. So first of all, I think it's important that we understand that global businesses are really operating in a nested structure of climate governance, where there's internal kind of firm organizational and incentives that they are responding to. At the same time, there's the regulatory regime, which is national politics, political economy, but also subnational, state, and local level policies and initiatives. And then, of course, there's global norms. And so in the book, I really talk about how these various forces in a systems approach of how firms are interacting with these various parts in the bottom and up and top down interplay. So that's one important takeaway, just that systems approach, but also the fact that corporations are strategic actors, and they act strategically to protect their market shares, to protect their reputation, and that will be an important important platform that they have. And also, I think in my book, I also really kind of head on challenge this idea of greenwashing and how that comes about. Because what I do, in addition to careful illustrative case studies, is that I follow firms across that decade of their environmental and economic performance, and I'm able to disentangle firms' pledges, so these binary decisions about whether they will participate in a climate initiative or set an internal price on carbon, and their actual effort of climate action and climate mitigation. And what I find is that without external pressures, whether coming from government, from stakeholders, or from the way that carbon disclosure policies are designed, and other policies, without the enforcement mechanisms, they will not, at the end of the day, produce the kind of outcomes, so the reduced carbon emissions that we really hope for as a society. So those, I think, are the main takeaways of my book.
Very good. So obviously the world continues to change and change
Yes,
very
indeed.
quickly. And on the issue of climate, we've seen a lot of rollback of commitments from corporations as well as from government. So in that sense, does it make it now easier to reveal who is greenwashing versus who is truly committed to the notion idea that climate is not just about social responsibility, not just for ethical and moral reasons, but we've talked about this as well, that it's also about risk reduction, which affects the bottom line, and also it's about driving innovation and profit. So is the rollback in some way revealing the greenwashing companies more so than was possible before, or did your method of investigation allow you to discover that regardless?
Well, I think in this political moment, there are indeed threats and pullbacks and I think the way kind of firms are responding, it's actually quite varied. So we are, I think, observing kind of green hushing, where some companies are indeed pulling back, and they're pulling back, in response to what's happening nationally in the U.S. or internationally. But at the same time, they're also maybe pulling back because they don't want the kind of climate activism to be revealing indeed what they're doing may not have been complete. But that said, though, I think those are kind of short-term impacts. What we're seeing kind of medium and long term is that there are still these kind of multi-leveled pressure points, and they are coming from national policy initiatives, what's happening in California with kind of renewed emphasis on the cap and trade program, which is even linked also to accountability. And the EU, while there has been some slowdown or pullback, it continues with their carbon disclosure policies as well as the carbon border tax. There's policy innovations in other places. I just got back from Singapore at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy there and learned a lot about some of their systems and infrastructure in place, including a very robust, it appears, carbon pricing as well. So, and of course, there are networks of cities, and your urbanists, so the networks of cities that are doing a lot of great things too, in terms of kind of providing some of the pressure points, young people in their climate activism, and also even within companies themselves. As my book shows, as I open up the black box, is that there are leaders and there are within companies where there are, managerial agency where they're responding to different pressure points from these different levels of multi-level governance structures.
Got it. So you use the term green hushing.
Yes.
Can you define that for people who may not be familiar with it?
Sure. So this idea that at times companies may continue doing what they're doing, pull back in some cases, but in some cases really continuing their programming, but not talking about it. It may not be a good moment politically, nor, it's so polarized that on one hand, we've got, this is a difficult political moment, what's happening nationally, but at the same time, there are also NGOs and activists who also demand more, and there is more attention on greenwashing. So on both ends, companies may continue what they're doing with some pullbacks, but then not talking about it.
Interesting. I was talking with the CEO of a very large retail company about 20 years ago, and they had some very aggressive sustainability initiatives, but they didn't want to bring that forward because they thought their customers would think things were costing more as a result. But in fact, it was actually saving the company money. So it was a kind of green hushing before green hushing was a thing, I guess.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
That way. All right. So you're focused on something called multi-level governance framework of climate change to explain climate action and how it's governed across multiple levels. You've touched on that already, but maybe you can dive a little bit more into what that means and how you investigated in the book too.
Sure, thank you. So in the book, what I put together and theorized is this multi-level climate governance, and it's really a strategic political economic model or framework where I say that firms are important actors, and they are part of this, again, as I mentioned, this nested structure, right? And they really take on a portfolio approach where they are engaging policy, markets, stakeholders, and regulation and global governance. And with this portfolio approach, they may not kind of embark on a stepwise process, but in fact, they have a strategy that is ongoing and simultaneous. And so, and companies, while there are institutional constraints, they have executive leaders who have managerial agency. So in my book, in this framework, managers are, or executive managers are what I call regulation brokers. So when the relative cost is low to over comply or to, because of complementary capabilities within companies. So for example, like Intel, where their engagement in green chemistry in the 80s and 90s, they were then able to leverage that to really having started ESG-like reporting even before that became popular, right? Because of the way they've been engaged in the in reporting to the EPA's the toxic inventory release, toxic release inventory. So that's one example of where it was then relatively cost effective or to then pivot or to leverage into climate related carbon management and whatnot. And so companies can be regulation brokers, but they can also be global governance norm brokers. They are engaged in these epistemic communities of experts and stakeholders where they come together to then translate some of global norms, such as a setting of price on carbon and the carbon disclosure even earlier on, where then it became something that they were able to then translate and bring in-house into their and proactively act on them before it became market norms or actual rules on the books. And with these, regulation brokering and also norm brokering within firms, the executive decision makers also they create these governing coalitions between leaders, but also engineers and policy analysts. So across the board or across the firm and into the boardroom. So then so again, companies are in this nested structure with corporate governance being an important part as well, with the incentives coming from these different levels of this nested structure.
Yeah, very good. So as we know, there's been a lot of backlash against ESG, right? Environmental, social governance investing or impact investing, whatever you want to call it. And it sounds like from what you investigate in your book, this is a really important driver of global governance around climate and other sustainability issues. So for those companies that are still committed to that idea, how are they talking about it? Are they still using the ESG framework? Are they going to CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, as it used to be called, as a way of continuing to be able to measure their success? What are the new and emerging strategies for allowing that to continue while at the same time, maybe back to your green hushing point, not elevating to the point where people say, hey, wait a minute, shareholders didn't want you to do this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that companies increasingly ESG is now baked in to how companies are managing their carbon emissions, and also they're not just talking about the environment, but they're also the social and governance aspects of it. And so I think increasingly it's becoming kind of business as usual. That said, if in the data in my book, when I look at the data between a decade's time between 2011 to 2020, where the data of ESG scores and rankings, is that when we adjust ESG scores for political interference, these scores are actually about 5 to 10% lower, which means that an important part of ESG accounting going forward is accountability, right? That we need scores that account for these, whether it's political lobbying or greenwashing that's, reported in the news. And so those are kind of maybe the frontiers of where we need to go is where we do, help firms be accountable. And they have many of these things they want to do, right? It's a strategic decision. There are incentives in the marketplace, also um, increasingly mandatory climate disclosure rules that are coming. We know in California that there are these sets of rules, policies, but it has always within, even before California, the EU, UK, city states like Singapore and Hong Kong, India, there are increasing these mandatory disclosure rules. So then now increasingly there is more accountability with respect to ESG.
Is it becoming more complicated for CEOs because you've got shifting political landscapes right here in the United States? You've got issues around EU disclosure, and if companies are operating in Europe, even if they're based elsewhere around the world, they need to abide by those. You've got the norming pressure coming from CDP and in some cases from shareholders around impacting investing. So how do CEOs, in your experience in talking with them, how do they navigate this complexity of potential disclosure requirements versus sort of internal pressures from the company and from investors as well?
Yeah,
it sounds really complicated. How do they do it?
It does sound complicated, but you know what? In my conversations and systematic interviews, as well as looking at the data, is that CEOs understand they are in this nested structure, and they have been. So this is nothing new, and they know that there are these pressure points, multi-level pressure points coming from the marketplace, from the regulatory regime at different levels and global governance, especially these multinational companies. Already that's their landscape. And so I think the CEOs ultimately they don't want patchwork policies.
Sure.
They would ultimately prefer being able to adhere to some similar rules across borders. But even without it, what they will do is once they have to comply, they will then roll that out globally. And we're seeing this, in Adidas, with multiple, facilities, factories across the world, Walmart, and Intel and Amazon and whatnot. And so ultimately, I think because of that, you will also see, as even with companies speaking, as well as where they're careful what they're saying politically, they're also supporting in part the policies that are already in place, and they don't want that changed because then that is new costs. Right, that they have to adhere to, and they would rather not. They rather have stability. I think, in terms of kind of facing these various kind of environments.
But are there some companies that are taking advantage of the chaos, right? Because they're always looking for competitive advantage. So maybe within some organizations, they are better placed to be able to deal with this complexity, and they can use that to their advantage against their competitors. Did you see any evidence of that?
Yeah, I am sure there are, and they will do so in ways that, but probably I would suspect always with the veneer of, of still cooperating and being a market player. And so I think that probably happens.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. Maybe that's number two if you can investigate that. Obviously, news continues to come in on a daily basis. There's the EPA rolling back of the endangerment finding of global greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. pulled out of the Paris Accord and so forth. And you've already touched on this a little bit, but how can cities like Los Angeles or the state of California, how can they respond in a way that meets the priorities of voters in California, meets the priorities of businesses in California to be leaders on the forefront of addressing issues around climate in ways that you've described as not just about social responsibility, that's important, but also as a way to reduce risk and potentially drive innovation.
Yeah, I think California is definitely a leader, and it's always been a long time in research of being, states being a laboratory, a policy laboratory, and California being a leader. California is part of kind of the climate alliance across, I think, 22 states, and most of them, yes, blue states, but not all. And so there is that alliance, and that's just here in subnationally in the U.S. But and then even to the local level, there are these city networks, right, around the world. And so California is can be a leader, and Los Angeles can be a leader. And while Los Angeles isn't the first or the number one leader, there's Copenhagen, Oslo, and whatnot in North Europe. What it does have is scale. And I know my understanding is that there is this grid modernization project. Is it called LA 100? Where there are some innovations there, and California having its own kind of utility company, and not having to, and so being able to kind of lead on that, and the innovations at the port with at the port with kind of large scale shipping and container technologies and whatnot. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I would be curious from your perspective, what are some things that perhaps some initiatives that perhaps the Price School or USC is involved in with respect to kind of climate action with Los Angeles as a leader?
Well, a few things, but this is about you, not about us. So I'll just mention a couple.
Yes.
One is obviously the Olympics coming up LA 28, and there's a sustainability commitment that's baked into the Olympics, not just leading up to the games and during the games, but what's the legacy of that afterwards. So we've been in discussions with the sustainability lead to think about ways that our students and faculty can participate in how to actually put those principles and goals into action. So that's one of them. It's a big one, and I'm really looking forward to further discussions on that. Lance and Yo, who introduced you, we've been involved with something called the Solar Canal Initiative. Lance, maybe you want to say a couple words on that. Then we'll get back to our featured speaker.
Working with a group called the Public Exchange at Dornsife, we put together a group of researchers from 7 different universities, almost all in California, to study any number of different aspects of how to cover large portions of California canals with solar panels to generate clean energy and reduce literally billions of gallons of water lost to evaporation.
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on. Jan's done some work, Adam's done some work. We'll bring that up in the Q&A afterwards. All right. So a few other questions, and then we'll open it up to larger questions. So one that comes up all the time, as you know, is AI, right? You can't have a conversation today without mentioning AI. It's impossible. And then one of the critiques, as we know, of artificial intelligence is that the water needs as well as the energy needs are skyrocketing. And so even some larger companies like Microsoft are now saying that they can't meet their renewable energy goals because of demand, increased demand with AI. At the same time, when you talk to folks who are working in this space, they will argue that AI can be a really powerful tool that can help us with climate modeling and potentially actually lead to better models that will ultimately reduce energy consumption. Maybe it was too early when you're doing your interviews, but did anything around AI and climate come up in your discussions? And if so, how were CEOs thinking about that?
Well, this is indeed like the AI paradox, right? With all the kind of energy needs and yet powerful tools for climate modeling. What I saw in the data is that apparently by 2030, the energy demand of AI could be equivalent to that of energy demand in Japan, so in an entire country, so just within a few years. So it is dramatic. And large kind of multinationals like Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, with the rollout of AI, with AI and also these centers, what is happening is that they're having challenges, let's say, with absolute emissions. So, of course, there's efficiency gains from the emissions intensity measures, but when it comes to absolute emissions, there is a gap in that kind of challenge of balancing the two. My understanding is that they're increasingly looking at renewables, but also stable renewables. So some of them are turning to to these kind of modular nuclear reactors, which there's a lot of potential, but also the nuclear waste and safety issues that entails being, placed close to urban centers. So I think that is an emerging issue that will have to be addressed, even as, AI also, it can help with climate modeling and can do a lot in terms of the climate, helping to meet the climate challenge. But then there are these additional kind of spillover effects into water usage, to other energy demands, and also the urban environment too, and urban rural environments. And
yeah, very good. All right. So Gallup every year does polls of the American public just to get a sense of issues that matter most, and jobs and security and those kinds of issues are always at the top. Climate's always at the bottom. Right? So in the American mind, climate is not a big priority for most people. Davos last year, I think there was hardly any mention of climate, where it was front and center for years. BlackRock, Larry, what's his name? Last name?
Fink.
Thank you, Larry Fink. It was very prominent supporter talking about climate as the issue that we need to solve. So there seems to be a waning of interest in climate as a central issue. Are there, in your discussions with CEOs, or even from your own personal perspective, are there ways that we can re-engage the American public in ways that make it matter, right? That make it an issue, that do actually affect the way that people behave?
Yes, and I think part of that is, again, I think in this kind of multi-level kind of framework where the bottom up, we need to take it to the local level, which, is happening right here, even in California, right, in Los Angeles, where when people are experiencing extreme climate or weather, which they are, and then they're seeing their cities, their local governments, local universities act in ways that can show them that there are ways to make a change and a way to get them engaged. I think that's one way of kind of turning around that public opinion, which is important, right? So the way of kind of everyone kind of like all hands on deck, if you will, and starting with the kind of bottom up, the top. My book talks about both the top down and bottom up interplay, and I think the bottom up interplay in this political moment is important, and just energizing, engaging localities and states, and not to lose sight of that we do, especially in our federal system. The national policies are important, but for the time being, what are some of these kind of local initiatives that's already happening and have been happening, right? And whether it's from decarbonizing the grid, or the cap and trade programs that can be stitched maybe even across localities across the world through local efforts, local state efforts, national efforts. And I think schools like Price and the School of Public Affairs at ASU and elsewhere, where we are educating and training the next generation of policymakers, but also managers, whether it's in corporations or city managers, of how to, this is the laboratory, right? There's time to right now to engage our students.
So in those polls, jobs and economy always end up as number one. How can we better link jobs with climate?
So this is actually one of the findings in my book, is the fact that corporations are increasingly bring their corporate social responsibility initiatives into the human resources. There are, so Adidas, for example, where within their company, it was called Green Company. Now it's part of workplace governance, because this increasing acknowledgement that our next generation care about working for purpose-driven companies, including climate protection, climate action, and how do you incentivize and retain these employees of the future? One way to do it is through engagement in climate, and it's happening internally in firms. Companies are, even if there are some pauses, again, like I said, there's this maybe short-term response versus the medium to long-term response where there are other parts of that multi-level governance structure where there are still pressure points.
Yeah, when we talked about this earlier, but one of the things that I found in talking with business leaders and leaders in other sectors as well is they see that this commitment, in addition, again, to being something that's ethically and morally responsible, it's also a way to drive innovation. It's also a way to drive profit. But the other thing that comes up over and over again is it's a way to recruit and retain talent, because next generation, any of you in this room, are looking at these companies and organizations, and you want to work in places that have a mission and purpose that aligns with your values. And for good reason too, because I'm not going to be around in 5 decades, maybe not even 3. I don't know. I'm not going to guess. But you're going to be here for the long term, and you want to make sure, understandably, that you're living in a world that can provide you with the support, the environmental support, the social support, the economic support that you have long, meaningful lives. So it makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I don't want to play down some of the real political and institutional constraints, right? I mean, I think, as I said, part of the short term, I think impact in terms of firms is that when they don't have the incentives or the investments from kind of our federal or national governments, is that there are some of these climate innovations, investments that will potentially be delayed, even though renewables are now renewable investments are much more affordable than fossil fuels, which has been shown in the data. And so then some of that innovation could be taking place elsewhere in the EU, in China, in other places. So there are real kind of constraints that companies are having to grapple with. But at the same time, I think, as I said earlier, medium to long term, there are these other pressure points coming right here in California, for example.
But green jobs are one of the fastest growing sectors nationally and globally. So to me, that's a very positive sign.
Yes, it is indeed.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, I'd like to now open it up to questions from the audience. Adam.
Well, maybe I can put in a plug for some of my colleagues. You
Yeah.
mentioned several topics, and so let me give you a quick summary. Antonio Bento, an environmental economist, prominent one in the Price School, done a lot of work on cafe standards, and especially testified in front of Congress on the issue. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. Environmental planners, Jen Julian has done a lot of work on greening of the ports.
Yes.
Santina Contreras has been doing a lot of work on community action in relation to the environment. I was involved in LA 100 initiative in terms of doing the economic impact study. And actually, that was the culmination of about 10 studies I've done on assessing the economic implications of climate action plans going back 15 years ago with Governor Christ in Florida and the environmental improvement and conservation departments in New York, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, New Mexico, several other states. Let Yan Tang speak for himself. He's done a lot of work in that area too. And then I'll come back and ask the question.
Jan, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I was explaining to Lily that the recent project I was working on is about groundwater management in California. It's not directly about climate change, but it's related, obviously. And one major finding from my research as well and some other colleagues around California is that about 10 years ago, the legislature had this mandate requiring local agencies, some of them are corporations, some of them local governments, to act together to have some collaborative framework for managing their local groundwater basins. So it's kind of typical of the multi-level governance issues about there's only so much you can do it from a higher level government. The state, the federal can can set up rules and regulations, but at the end of the day, solutions have to find at the local level. Similar to the study about corporation, that you can't really force people to do something they don't really want to do that is against their interest. So in my research, to get to the conclusion is there are a lot of difficulties in terms of how the local agencies now, how the local corporations handle this kind of mandate from the state government. They might formally collaborate, but again, what they come up with in terms of the actual groundwater management plans often reflects their local interests more than what the state wants them to do. I'm sure Lily's book would offer a lot of insights about how this kind of vertical authority, how we can make it work with the local need for collaboration. So actually, I was going to ask you about, I'm teaching our public management doctoral seminar. One question I ask my students is, how do we reconcile the need for hierarchical authority with those potential conflict between the need for hierarchical authority versus the need for horizontal collaboration? I'm sure my student can find a lot of insight from the books.
Yeah, thank you so much. The way I look at it is really, again, with that kind of nested structure. I think that it's not ever which one wins out. I think really is a lot of times, at least from the perspective of corporations, they're taking this portfolio approach. So they will work with kind of localities as well as national, mandates or global mandates, right? And of course, kind of addressing kind of their market needs and especially with these global businesses. So I really do, not that it's harmonious, but it is, in my mind, not necessarily one or the other, or even if the fact that there is necessary conflict, it is part of their kind of strategic management, if you will. They will simultaneously be the regulation broker as well as the normal broker, and of course, holding constant what they're already doing in the marketplace.
Interesting. All right. Yes, please. Can you say who you are, too?
Yes, Jody Muller. I'm a grade school alum. Affordability is the big buzzword, especially here in California, for the last year. And I know that's after your research. But I absolutely agree with you that corporations are really invested in programs like cap and trade, even the fossil fuel companies. They don't want those programs to go away in California and those other states because they've invested in them. But I'm curious if you've given some thought about these policies and this affordability narrative that we have and where we go. Quebec just rolled back some of their timeline, not their goals, but the timeline in which to meet them. Is that kind of something you see happening more and more to address some of the affordability issues so that we don't roll back the goals, but maybe take a little longer to reach some of these goals so that we aren't hurting the people who can least afford it the most with some of the policies?
Yeah, no, I hear you about affordability. And I think that is a challenge kind of globally with, kind of inflationary pressures, of course, the macroeconomics of tariffs and all of that. And that's being felt kind of locally, right, in terms of affordability. Yes, I think a lot of times there are these trade-offs, like real trade-offs of these, kind of multi-objectives. And especially when the political economy, the climate is the way it is, there will be these kind of pullbacks. I don't have a solution per se, other than that delay is better than just everything off the agenda altogether. So there are these kind of real delays, in terms of looking at how, looking at cost effectiveness. Ultimately, I think we want to be able to pursue all the, climate protection, environmental protection cost effectively. I think there are different ways where there could be, ways to at the local level, raising money potentially, or at the state level, for various projects, but there are definitely trade-offs.
So you're an economist, so I'm going to talk about externalities.
Externalities, yeah.
And we don't internalize those externalities very well. So true cost accounting. I mean, one of the issues about delaying this, and I get the affordability argument, is we're loading that debt onto future generations. Presumably, the younger people in the audience don't like to hear that. But so how do you raise that message that we're not fully accounting for all costs when we're talking about affordability?
Yeah, I think in economics, there's this concept of discount rate, and we often discount the future because it's not present. In some ways, I think a way to resolve this economic problems is actually not through economics. It is, in fact, I think there is and this is where I think at a school like the Price School and School of Public Affairs at ASU, it's just about the public interest, right? The public value of resilience and how we pass that on to the next generation of how do we lower the discount rate, the way we discount the future. And through that is, it's through public, this idea of there is public good and public value. Insofar as we can, we want private actors like corporations to account for, to kind of expand their profit maximizing problem to private politics, to public politics, to values. Insofar, so we want that. Whether that's going to happen or not, it may or may not. But there may be ways of through economics and other means of kind of making sure that all these things matter.
Yeah, and pricing ecosystem services, I think, is something that needs to come back into conversation.
And setting the price, and so one I think example, kind of in the private sector, I think is a great development, and was initially just a norm, kind of at the global governance level, is setting a price on carbon. A concrete example is what Microsoft has done, and it is now the largest climate spender, if you will. Yes, they're spending it on carbon removal. There's some, maybe even ethical kind of debate about whether that is good or bad or anywhere in between. But the fact is they in I think it's around 2010, 2012.
About the internal carbon tax?
The internal carbon fee, where Microsoft was able to do that in their kind of individual business units, and through that kind of raise funds for spending on these climate investments. And so I think that is one way where economics can be very powerful, where you set that price signal, whether it's within a company or a cap and trade program, or a carbon border tax in the EU.
Yeah, I said tax and you said fees, so you're the politician.
Yeah.
Okay.
It can be both.
Next question. Yeah.
My name is Alex. I'm also a Price alum. I wanted to ask, you mentioned that green jobs were one of the quickest growing out there. I wanted to ask, what qualifies as a green job, and what would instead be more so along the lines of something facetious like greenwashing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm going to send you my paper because I just wrote a paper on this issue. And it's a spectrum, right? So it can range from everything from the CSO of a company to even someone who might be an electrician, a line electrician, but is working for a company or organization that is making climate investments. So for instance, in the electrification of the power system. So it runs a whole spectrum. But that's, when you're coming up with these definitions, they're always going to be mushy, right? There's no question about it. So you can expand the definition to include more jobs. You can reduce it to, but I actually distinguish in that paper between green jobs and sustainability jobs. So green jobs are those that have ultimately some impact on preserving the environment, right? Sustainability jobs, because sustainability is a larger concept, includes environmental protection and stewardship, but also includes quality of life and human well-being as key factors for present and future generations. So like any definition, it can be nudged in one way or another. But there are companies and organizations that do track this. And if you give me your email address, I'll send you the paper.
Appreciate that.
All right, of course. Lance.
the primary focus of a lot of large public companies is the current quarter's earnings. And that's what CEOs and CFOs focus on almost more than anything else. How is it, in your experience with corporations, how do you get them to focus more on the long-term implications on their business? Forget whether it's a good recruiting strategy, but climate change is going to wreak havoc on the global economy. But how do you break that and that narrow focus, near-term risk analysis with longer-term risk analysis?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think in many ways, though, while they are focused on these quarterly profits, they also have the resources that could be expended on larger projects, longer term projects. And one of the findings in the book is about complementary capabilities that firms have these large global businesses have been able to identify where in cases where then they are able through that to lead on climate within their sector. So I'm thinking about, for example, I mentioned Intel and green chemistry, but Adidas with what they have done with their leading on using ocean plastics and on material innovation. And that actually is harder to dismantle because it is now part of their product manufacturing process. And then of course, again, that multi-level nested structure. Adidas is a company that is a EU-based, a German-based company.
Adidas.
Adidas. It's Adidas, exactly.
Yeah,
And so they're operating even though globally they are operating in a slightly different kind of political economy, right? And so but then they're leading now really on some of these kind of recycling materials in footwear and fashion and whatnot.
Upcycling.
Upcycling. And so I think while they are also, like any company, have shareholders and having to pay attention to quarterly profits, they have this kind of complementary capabilities where they are also acting on that, and that could pay down the line, especially if they're one of the first movers. And so I think there are a lot of these strategic management related issues, and it's a form of risk management as well as product offering too, right? So it's this multi-pronged problem portfolio approach. So I think both are happening, and some companies do it maybe better than others. Intel, although an early leader with green chemistry, they are obviously right now having to do some catch up in terms of what's happening in the semiconductor space, right? Profit wise.
Yeah, it's like skunk works in some companies, right? Well, they'll make the extra investment for people to have what might be outlandish ideas, but end up being, in some cases, the most profitable ventures inside the company. Other questions? Do you have questions online?
No. And I encourage those of you online to.
And I'm going to go to Adam because he had a question.
And
Okay, all right.
Thanks.
Yes, at the back, please.
We talked about how
And say who you are. Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Catherine. I'm a current student at Price.
Yes.
And we were talking about kind of how we motivate people to care more about climate and how that ranks low right now in the policies. But then you also mentioned how a big factor for companies is that they want to show that they're doing climate things because they think that the people that they're hiring might value that. So I guess how do we go from motivating more people who are looking in the industry to care about climate, and how do we push that, especially in terms of public policy or specifically on urban planning student, and how does that connect with the conflicting or maybe not conflicting interests of a company?
That's a great question and a loaded one. It's a great question. My understanding is that a lot of young people, this next generation, are very interested in climate, engaged. They might not know how to engage per se at times. Is it through climate activism? Is it through the products and services they buy or engage in? So I think there are just different ways, and depending on your interests, right? You are here at the Price School and an urban planning student, and are there ways to, kind of engage your fellow students and in some of the projects that you're engaged in, sharing, kind of communicating some of these kind of city level initiatives that can be quite engaging. And Chris, you mentioned the Olympics, right? And I was really kind of excited and to hear about some of the initiatives around the Olympics with transportation and other that hopefully could be longer term. And I wonder if there are ways, I'm sure the city are already thinking about this, of getting young people, notably, but also all ages, involved in some of these kind of local level climate action. Because sometimes I think it does start like locally like that, right? Especially in this particular moment, where people are starting to feel the effects of climate change, with the fires, with just all sorts of kind of weather events, but feeling, I think there's a sense of, and this is getting away from hardcore governance or economics, but the idea of feeling kind of not sure what they can do, and feeling maybe even depressed. And so how to engage young people in an active way, kind of in action, like, taking, like, there are things you can do. And then once it becomes something where it's collective action, we have more people engaged, then there will be these ripple effects that happens, that can then, through public policy or governance, be then institutionalized. Right. At some point, we're at a policy school. I am interested in policy, where some of those, kind of local actions, policy laboratories, even here at the university, can then, when the time is right, can then be something that becomes institutionalized.
Yeah, I think connecting it to other things that people care about. So I mentioned jobs in the economy. That's always going to be a priority. But as an urban planner, you can address climate issues while also doing something that's beautiful, right? So you can connect beauty with climate, right? So it's not just something that people are being hit over the head with, but it's something that they can enjoy in their everyday lives that also meets climate goals at the same time. Thank you for the question. Next question. Yes, please.
So we've heard a lot today about climate action at different levels, whether that be at a very local level, whether it be with business interests, whether it be with public sector interests. So I wanted to ask, for the purposes of advancing climate action, what would you consider to be more important? Personal behavioral choices, personal decision-making, behavioral changes, things along those lines at the individual level, or more so regulatory decisions, regulatory incentives, disincentives, nudging people one way or another in that strategy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I maybe it's a cop-out to say both, but I do indeed believe in both. I think there's synergies, because it's hard to set public policies and have buy-in if you don't already have within the culture, within the kind of the behavioral routines and rhythms, those, like, you need that in order to actually initiate policy, and certainly at the implementation side of policy, right, to make it happen, for policy to become effective. That said, there's collective action challenges when it's just one, a community or a few people, we do need policies to then affect a larger, kind of group and society. And yet these policies need to be, to have individual behavioral incentives as well. And so it's really kind of the coming together of the two, and both can be pursued, I think, simultaneously. And at a school like a public policy school, we have these various kind of training and different classes where you are looking at different aspects, different dimensions of the problem, so that then it can all come together.
Yeah, I think changing norms is a really powerful force, and I think a great example of that is smoking cessation, right? So 40 years ago, we'd all be sitting here right now smoking away, and now that would, we'd throw you out of the building, not just because it's against policy, but it's against social norms. So I think there's some examples from history, I think, that we can draw on to think about how do we get that sort of critical mass of normed behavior change to help us meet those goals.
That's a really good point, Chris, about the smoking cessation. So I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. And this is where there was a campaign that the city of Santa Clara or the county of Santa Clara had students be part of a campaign against tobacco smoke. And eventually, 2 years later, the smoke-free ordinances got passed. And so even the elementary school kids were part of that campaign, which then became a local ordinance, right? So it's just interesting how it is, in many ways, was this all hands on deck. And so in some ways, I think, climate change is another policy issue area, just like tobacco smoke.
I have a bit of a follow-up question. So I think to summarize, both of you agreed that both are important, that personal choices can affect what eventually becomes regulatory decisions. So as a bit of a follow-up, I want to know for your own personal decisions, how did the two of you get here today? Did you walk, bike, take public transport, or did you drive?
I drove.
I actually walked across the street from the USC hotel. But no, and I do own electric vehicles and try to take public transportation as much as possible. But at the same time, it's not as easy in a more car-dependent society, whether it's in LA or Phoenix. But for sure, these personal decisions do matter.
I owned an EV until someone ran a red light, talk about norm behavior in Los Angeles, smashed into me. So that's a norm we need to change as well, red light running. It's astonishing from someone coming from somewhere else. It's like red light is a suggestion in Los Angeles, as far as I can tell.
Do you eat meat? Do I eat meat?
Yeah. On occasion, yes.
Okay. That's the most effective way to lower your carbon.
Yeah. And one thing to point out about that, thanks for bringing it up, is try maybe, one or if for those who are meat eaters, 1 or 2 days of eating vegetarian. Which is something that my family and I started. We got sidetracked during the pandemic, but
I introduced you to the vegetarian Indian restaurant.
You did in Tempe.
That's right. There
exactly.
you go.
And it's very delicious.
Yeah, there you go. All right, thank you. Next question. Yes, please.
My name is Scott, and I'm a graduate student in the Sustainability Management Program.
Yeah.
In your research, do you see the emergence of mandatory reporting requirements eventually overtaking and making obsolete voluntary frameworks, or will there be future advantages for companies and firms to use both?
Yeah, a lot of times when and I'll come right back more kind of straight to your question, but in terms of like mandatory versus voluntary, and a lot of times what we see is this kind of the two working together, a lot of times starting with voluntary. So for example, for nearly 2 decades now, companies have reported to the Carbon Disclosure Project proactively. So in many ways, through these voluntary approaches, they've experimented and kind of some of the kinks have been worked out of how these programs are run. And in fact, a lot of the mandatory programs, including the ones in California and even the federal one, which is no longer, and as well as the disclosure policies in the EU, they have taken a lot of the systems that the Carbon Disclosure Project or CDP have worked out and the experimentation that has happened with firms have become part of the policy itself. And so a lot of times they actually voluntary approaches can be a segue into something more mandatory. And so a lot of companies actually, these global, large companies did not come out to be anti these mandatory approaches that, mandatory laws, because they've practiced. It has become more and more cost effective. Of course, they're not happy having to, report all their risk management plans. And so then the California had that 2-pronged laws, right? And one is currently kind of on pause. But in terms of the actual reporting of the carbon management emissions, that is still continuing, right? And they practiced. So I would say from a policy kind of scholarship perspective, we see private-public voluntary and mandatory approaches kind of working hand in hand.
Yeah, and things are moving so quickly. It's going to be a career for you, I think, Lily, to keep up with it. So before we close, I want to thank those of you who joined us online for coming in with us today electronically. We appreciate you being here.